Hey guys, welcome back. Besiege Early Access coverage. This is episode 14. I'm Enigmius, and today, as promised in a previous episode, we're focusing on velocity. We're going to try and throw something very fast. That's the goal. Now, in order to meet that goal, I decided we're going to go with a simple sling design. It's going to be swinging arms with boulders attached to grabbers, and then when it's spinning up as fast as we can get it, we're going to release the boulders and see how far they go. I used a trick this time for the central shaft where I basically put an unpowered cog. In this case, I put it on a ballast block, and then I put another cog on top of it. And before I do anything else, I attach a brace from the top of the second cog to the top of the first cog, and that fuses them together so that they spin together. It's basically like making one large cog out of the two smaller ones with many teeth, so that we can interact with those with more powered cogs and not have to worry about any kinds of crazy angular setups or anything like that in order to make it work. So those 5 cogs underneath that green bordered origin box are all fused together, acting as one, and then we'll have some cogs on the side of that origin box that will transfer the movement to the cog on top, and that cog on top is going to be holding the arms that spin the boulders. So just like we've done previously, we set up 4 pistons with a motorized cog on each one, and each one has its own keybind, and each of the motorized cogs is on its own speed. They start off at a slow speed, and they gradually, with each one, increase in speed so that we can engage the slowest one to spin up the central shaft to a slow speed, and then engage the second motorized cog, and the central shaft will go a little bit faster, and then the third will make it even faster, all the way up until we get to the maximum speed, or the thing flies apart. Because that's definitely an option with this game. We're building out of wood primarily for the frame. There have been times when I would very happily build this out of ballast blocks and braces exclusively. I encountered a bug with the pistons where if they aren't connected to a unified wooden frame, they wouldn't work reliably. You could press the button and they wouldn't work. And then you would stop the simulation, you start it, and you try it again, and it would work, but something else wouldn't work. It was kind of a weird thing, but I found out that you can solve it by making sure that they're all sort of interconnected on a wooden frame. Bob's your uncle. I wasn't going to mess around with it anymore to try and experiment and see if there were other ways that I could do it that didn't involve explicitly a wooden frame. And the main thing was just to get it working. Now, I've also, in this case, used the sliders that I've been using recently. Anytime I use pistons recently, I use sliders as well to keep the pistons kind of as stable as we can get them. So you'll notice every piston has a slider on each side of it, and then we go around and we set up the all the motorized cogs with their appropriate speeds and their appropriate individual key bindings, and then it's a simple matter of bracing everything up so that hopefully, very key word, hopefully, everything stays together when we try and get everything up to speed, which is not necessarily always going to be the case. There's always going to be bracing, and then there's always going to be testing, and there's always going to be failure, and that leads to more bracing. But we have to start the cycle somewhere. So we do a little bit of a test here. Using the pistons, engaging them to the central shaft, the shaft spins up. Everything works. That little piece sticking up out of the top there, that's going to be what's holding the arms that throw the boulders. You can see now we're building out a temporary structure for those arms made out of wood. The whole idea is that I wanted this thing to make a very large circle when the arms were spinning, but I wanted to keep it within the bounding box, so if we did decide to take it into a map and see how well we did, we would be able to potentially clear that map. Not that that's ever going to happen with this design, but it would be an option. In order to do that, I decided what we would do is we would have the arms extending out from that central pin in the top of the central shaft, and then there will be swivels on the end of those arms with arms that hang down connected to graspers that hold the boulders, so that everything fits inside the bounding box until we engage the simulation, and then as we start to spin it up, the forces on the boulders trying to push them away from the central shaft will cause the arms to lift up. We'll end up with a larger circle, creating more velocity for the boulders, potentially flinging them farther. So that's the whole idea. A little bit tricky to implement. You can see right now we've got the boulders in place, and we're basically trying to space them in such a way that they're going to fit within the bounding box, but we're going to get the arms attached the way that we need them to be attached. And as we're setting it up here in the preliminary setup, so to speak, they're going to be a little bit low. You can see they're just barely above the ground now, and as soon as we engage the simulation, everything's going to settle a little bit. And what's going to happen is that the boulders are going to hit the ground, and then in trying to spin up the whole system, the boulders are going to be dragging on the ground, and the friction is going to be that little bit of extra force that the machine isn't able to overcome. So the easiest way to correct that is to raise the boulders a little bit higher above the ground. But one of the things we also did is we changed the swivel for ball joints, and that gives us a little bit of extra freedom of movement. For some reason, the ball joints kind of go in place backwards, I've noticed. You end up with the ball into the thing that you're anchoring it to, and then whatever you connect it to goes on the base, but in this case it doesn't really matter. The whole idea of the ball joint is that it's got a wider degree of motion than the swivels. So now you can see we've got the boulders are elevated off the ground. We don't have to overcome the friction, and as soon as we start to spin things up, immediately the boulders start drifting outwards. And when we get it up to top speed, whatever that happens to be, you'll see that they're pretty much vertical. The whole arm thing is basically straight across from boulder to boulder. Now, very important in order to make any of this work is the fact that we have the two boulders, because if I only had one, which is what the original design in my head called for, I would have had to figure out a way to balance the entire machine to offset that weight's basically spinning on one side. By having a boulder on either side, it's self-balancing. We don't have to worry about it. It also means that we either have to release both boulders at the same time, and one of them is going to fly in the opposite direction of the one that we're theoretically aiming, or we could set up the key bindings to release them individually, but you would have to do it very quickly, because as soon as you release one, you're going to have a tremendous amount of weight pulling on the other side where the other boulder is, and it's going to cause serious problems for the machine in terms of either keeping it together or at least keeping it right side up. But in this case, this is sort of the first trial. We've barely got any bracing in place. We're trying to bring it up to speed. It takes a while. It's not a quick process bringing it up to speed, but you can see already that it's basically, like I said, straight across from boulder to boulder now. And the whole thing just starts to wobble and twist and tilt and skew its way but then it goes so much faster. Right before the end, it looked like it was like, yeah, we finally got this. Now, I've thrown, I think, parts of this machine farther than I've thrown anything else in the game so far, with the exception of some of the things that I was throwing with our contracted spring catapult that we made. I mean, that was a pretty good test in terms of generating a tremendous amount of energy inside the machine and then releasing it spectacularly in an utter failure. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. What we need to do now is just kind of take a look at the design and figure out where we can brace it up. But in changing the top that little bit there, I brought those new wooden beams too close to the unpowered cogs on the side, and it basically binds them up so that they couldn't turn. Not a big deal. We'll just have to extend it out a little bit further. I wanted it to be kind of symmetrical, a little bit uniform, so that it was easier to brace and kind of visualize in my head where the braces were going and what they were doing. It's not really that important. It's not something that we can't overcome. So now we're just basically doing a lot of diagonal bracing, trying to make sure that things can't push closer together to things that they're not supposed to get closer to, and otherwise, doing our best to not make it too rigid. Someone left a comment recently pointing out the very valid point that it is possible to make things too rigid, at which point they encounter all kinds of other different problems that you can't overcome unless you relax them a little bit, give them the opportunity to flex in small amounts, because it's better to have something flexing slightly than vibrating, so to speak. That's something that you learn in a lot of different trades and a lot of different disciplines, is that vibration is pretty much your enemy in anything that you might be doing, unless you're like making sex toys or breaking up concrete or something. It's not a good idea. So we've braced things up a little bit along the top, and now a little bit of bracing down from the top to the bottom, again reducing that twisting that we saw in the top, and hopefully holding the bottom together a little bit better than what we had before. The other thing to consider is that the more braces you have, the lower the frame rate. Each brace is kind of a a system in itself that has to be evaluated in terms of the forces that are being applied to this, that, and the other thing by this, that, and the other thing, and it's always changing as you're running the simulation. Too many braces, frame rate drop. So a reason to be a little bit moderate and kind of test things as we go. What I'm not showing you is that between a lot of these braces, I'm doing testing to see how things work and finding out that, things are still breaking a little bit too early, things aren't working quite the way that I would like it to. The reason I'm not showing you is because it does take a long time for things to spin up. It's just not really that useful to look at. Suffice it to say, all the braces that we're adding are being added in, small amounts to brace, small segments. And then things are tested to see how things are working. If it's still kind of flying apart a little bit too early, then we add some more braces and try it again. Now this will be the final spin up as a part of this test. We've got things braced as well as possible. I've gone through and I changed the weight on the ballast blocks at the ends of the arms, the spinning arms. Drop them down to 0.2 instead of the 0.5, which is their default value, so they weigh as little as possible. And I've also changed the ratio on the gearbox, so to speak. I've reduced the speed of the motorized cogs so that we can spin things up a little bit more smoothly at the expense of a top speed, because we weren't getting anywhere near halfway to the top speed anyways. So the whole idea is by reducing the speed increments, we would get closer to that top speed before things started breaking. And that's really all we can do. So that's really all we can do. All we can do is all we can do. We're spinning it up as soon as it gets up to a reasonable speed and we think we've got things about as far as they can go before they start to break anymore. We'll release the boulders. We'll see how far the boulders go. And then in the next episode, we'll do something else. We'll do another machine that does a thing. It'll either be a conceptual sort of component of a thing, or it'll be a complete system. Who knows? If you want to be notified when I add those videos, you can always subscribe to my channel and or follow me on social media. Links for social media always in the information section below the video. Please leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.